Let me just say just very briefly about the William Davidson Foundation. We're committed to the economic, cultural, and civic vitality of Detroit, Southeast Michigan, of the Jewish community, and of Israel. And one of the things that has been core to the values of the institution, and I also want to call out my colleague Lisa Katz, as well as a member of our executive committee of the board, Ralph Gerson. I don't see any other board members here this morning, but one of the values was to do things in partnership. And I think today is a good illustration of how we're trying to live out that value, because we're learning alongside of you, and we want to do so. So this day is not just us about telling the story about Detroit and all the reasons why you should come back and spend money and invest and do what we're doing, but we also want to learn from you at the William Davidson Foundation. I think a lot of you are here because you share that value of collaboration and partnership. Okay. Last thing before I introduce the panel, I was talking with somebody last night and they said this was their very first time coming to Detroit. So I'm just curious in the room, if this is your first time being in Detroit, just raise your hand.
Wow.
That's incredible. That's more than I thought. For how many of you has it been at least 10 years since coming to Detroit? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, we're seeing this a lot. A lot of people who had never been to Detroit. Oops.
Okay, Darren.
I knew the podium was up here for a reason. We're seeing that a lot. A lot of people are excited to see the story of Detroit as it's unfolding, the new story of Detroit. So we're going to get started telling that story. We have a fantastic panel of, what was the term, normal people? Andrew, that you were saying, normal people, but they're doing pretty extraordinary things. And I couldn't think of a better panel to talk about the philanthropic investment in the entrepreneurial community than the one that's assembled here. So I'm going to sit down, and clearly that's a safer place for me. So we're just going to go down the line here. I'm not going to do full introductions. You have the bios of the panelists in your packets, okay? So I'll just introduce them, name, title, and ask them a few questions. May have a follow-up here and there. But then I really want to invite all of you to ask your own questions or make your own contributions. I should say that when we were imagining what this event might be, we were imagining a lot more people who were just entering the field of funding entrepreneurship, when in fact the folks that we have in this room have been investing in entrepreneurship for years, if not decades. And so I really want to draw a lot of those experiences and lessons from this room. So after we go through the panel, have your questions and contributions ready. To my left, Miriam Noland, who is the president of the Community Foundation of Southeast Michigan. And you've heard a lot about the New Economy Initiative, which is a project of the Community Foundation. I want you to take us back 10 years, and further if you want, to 2007 when New Economy Initiative was started. What was happening at the time? How did it all come together? And feel free to introduce other aspects of either the Community Foundation's work or other aspects of your life that you want the group to hear.
Sure. Well, first, I want to also welcome you to Detroit. We love having you here. And I can tell you that the Detroit you see today is not what it was 10 years ago. The amount of change is almost unbelievable. So I will take you back. That was the question, and I'll try to be brief. In 2006, my board chairman, who had been vice chair of the Ford Motor Company twice, said to me, it's the economy, and we've got to do something. And we're a little community foundation. We cover a 7-county region, 5 million people, from Detroit to Ann Arbor to Toledo. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, we're supposed to fix the economy? But what do? Your board chairman says something, you go to work. So I called another board member who had just left the Clinton White House, and he'd worked for Bob Rubin. And I said, Paul, what do we do? And so what did he do? He really spent about half of his time for the next 3 or 4 months helping us try to think about this. He brought in his economic advisor friends from around the country and went to work. During that process, what did we do? We reached out to our friends. You always reach out to your friends. And we took a group to go see John Tyler, first person we talked with. And we went to Ohio that had the Fund for Northeast Ohio. And I was tired of hearing about all the good stuff they were doing. I figured we can do it better. That's what I just learned. Entrepreneurs, you want to do it, you can do it too. And what did they tell us to think about? They said focus on 3 things: talent, innovation, and culture change. In the context of Detroit that had gone downhill for 50 years, I don't want to tell all the bad stories. The lights were out, nothing was working, and our mayor was going to jail, and 40 of his friends, and so it was not a great time. Talent, innovation, culture change. What does a fundraiser do? You call your friends. And all the foundations back then that I called said, we don't do that kind of work. We're not going to fund people to go start for-profit businesses. We're charities. Later you can ask me how we convinced them that they needed to put up $100 million, which they did, to their credit, on a concept that was pretty loosely defined. So that's where we were 10 years ago.
So, Dave, you're president of the Ralph C. Wilson Jr. Foundation, and part of the reason you're up here on this panel is because of that. But also, you were the head of the Hudson Weber Foundation back in 2006, 2007, and later became the director of the New Economy Initiative. So pick up the story from where Miriam left off. So how did you play in this space? And then talk a little bit about the arc of New Economy Initiative. What were some of the successes and failures, or some of the evolution of the work?
So Miriam did the hard work. She raised the money and then basically said, figure it out. Simple. How to spend $100 million with 10 funders, all with their own ideas on how to spend $100 million. And I think Benji will agree with this. Everybody's opinion was exactly the same. We had 10 foundations and about 53 different expected outcomes for the fund. It became something everyone hung something on. So we had to take a big step back, and I'll start with the things that didn't work, because we did start with this notion of talent and innovation and culture change. So talent, we had a workforce component to this. And Lisa Katz, who is now working with Darren, was one of the great success stories of that Workforce Intelligence Network, real-time data around where people should go and how to do that work. But it was apparent very quickly we could have very little influence or impact there. So we jettisoned that program within about 18 to 24 months after coming on. The notion of innovation, well, what does that mean? In what way? Is that high growth? Is that grassroots? Is that anybody? Is that sector specific? We had to start digging into that work. The quick lesson learned in that space was start with assets, not sectors. The world was sector based at the time. If you wanted to work with the state, you had to be in alternative energy, you had to be in advanced manufacturing, you had to be in the digital economy. There were specific sectors. If you didn't fit, they wouldn't fund you. And they wouldn't fund the accelerators and the institutions working in the entrepreneurial ecosystem. We came along and did something very different. We said, we're industry agnostic. We have incredible assets. We have tons of engineers. We have one of the largest creative classes in North America. We have the most crossed border in North America. We're surrounded by fresh water. We've got 3 research universities within 75 miles of each other that are tier 1 recognized internationally research universities. So we started focusing on the assets and became sector agnostic. 3, culture change. So when we looked at the issue of culture change, we reformatted all of the programming with this notion of, can we give hope? Can we give pathways? Can we give line of sight? I love Andrew's notion, if you can't see it, you can't do it. Around the notion that entrepreneurship, that self-determination of outcome was achievable. And that's where we really, really focused our time. So our first trip back to John Tyler, where we essentially convinced Kaufman to come in as a major partner and provide the fast-track training program for anyone who would walk in the front door, and back to TechTown. TechTown did 3 entry sessions for anyone who thought they wanted to start a business. 1,200 potential entrepreneurs showed up in 90 days to 3 one-day sessions. And it broke this logjam. and people started to understand it wasn't about sectors. While it was about talent, it was about stimulating talent that perhaps we didn't see in the industry. And one final thing here, the greatest claim to fame for me at NEI was I was smart enough to recruit Pam Lewis. So if you heard from her last night, that's the lasting legacy, and that's the upgrade in staffing necessary to go to the next level.
Not true.
Thank you, Dave. I'm going to introduce Tasha in just a minute, but I wanted to also talk about how NEI first assembled this $100 million, and later on there was an additional infusion of funds, $40 million from another set of foundations, or the same set expanded. William Davidson Foundation jumped in for the second phase, and it's just in the midst of closing a third round of funding of $30 million or so. So the total amount over this last decade or so of capital amassed for New Economy Initiative is around $170 million. I say that to put in context JP Morgan Chase's investment and commitment. So Tasha is the Detroit program manager for JP Morgan Chase, and Jamie Dimon and JP Morgan Chase have made a very significant commitment to this city, which I'll let her describe. But also, Tasha, perhaps you could talk a little bit about how did that commitment come to be, why, and what were some of the conditions that you saw on the ground that made Jamie and the rest of the folks and yourself confident to be able to make that kind of commitment.
Thank you for that, and thank you for being here, and welcome for all of those who have just come to Detroit for the first time. For us, we've had a history of being in Detroit for over 80 years. And an eye-awakening moment for our CEO was hearing about the bankruptcy and the troubles that were happening in Detroit, and realizing that this is an American city that's always had inventors, always had people that set the tone for the rest of the country, a very iconic city, and was in trouble. And we were a major organization and investor in the city, and quite frankly have been doing very well in Southeast Michigan for a very, very long time. And we're a little bit struck by the fact that the economy was the way it was in the city, given how the success that we were having in the marketplace. So the CEO just kind of picked up the phone and said, similar to your conversations, Miriam, with your chairman, I guess this is what chairmans do, pick up the phone and say, hey, fix it, and hang up the phone, right? And so no direction, no dollar amount, no kind of thought about how that would happen, just knew that there was talent within the firm that could really think about this and bring some solutions to the city. So what did? We started talking to our friends, right? I mean, I think Dave probably got sick of us hounding him, and a number of folks on this panel and across Detroit received phone calls for JP Morgan Chase for over a 9-month period. What we knew was that the talent was already here. We knew, based on how our markets were doing, that industry was here. We knew the innovation was here. We knew it was already here. It was just our job as a corporate citizen to figure out how to use our resources to help accelerate what was happening. And over a course of about 9 months of conversations and hearing the different programs that were on the ground, we started to just put on paper all the things that we wanted to help to accelerate and bring more really bring more press and more attention to that was already happening in Detroit. And NEI was one of those big ones for us. If you look at our portfolio now, we probably fund 70% of the organizations that sit within the NEI organization, directly or indirectly. Over a course of those 9 months and those conversations with friends and family and people around the room and talking to other corporations, we landed on a $100 million commitment over 5 years, of which incorporated talent, workforce, and skills training, community development, physical development, and placemaking. And of course, our financial capabilities in making sure that people, once they did acquire more wealth, that they knew how to keep it. And then the last thing, small business growth and entrepreneurship. So a big part of that was funding up organizations that were doing the work. And what we saw on the ground was that there was a lot of coordination. It already happened. I think the key to NEI for us was that there was coordination among all of these different organizations, that there was a handoff of the entrepreneurs from, if you need one sector of work, whether that's being accounting services or getting ready for a loan, they were actually handing themselves off, and the the outcomes of what had changed from being, I trained someone, I counseled that person, and they're ready to go, to let me look at the holistic piece of the business, let me mentor in a full way, and hand them off to all the different pieces to make sure that entrepreneur is successful. And that happened because NEI had made this, created this coordination. So that was just one piece that we saw throughout all of the threads of our investment, was that happened in all the different sectors in the workforce. It needed to be strengthened, and we wanted to have that same bit of coordination. We took that same kind of model place that was happening with NEI, and so we want to see that happen in the workforce. We want to see that happen more with community development. And there's a lot of different pieces that philanthropy had already led the way of doing. As was said earlier, the theory of change is what a lot of us philanthropy, a lot of us foundations have. We have our theory of things, a change of how it would happen and what needs to happen, and that doesn't always match up with everyone else's, and we get bored with our own theory of change from time to time, and Dave will probably attest to that. What had to happen, the cultural shift that we had in Detroit, was that we ended up having this more coordinated body of work among all of us towards a single body of change or vision, and stuck with it for the long game. And NEI, and I know that Benji's going to talk about Detroit Future City, that was the same thing. It was a long game. This is the 50-year kind of trajectory of how physical placemaking could happen, and even that was something that we built on when we built our investment of $150 million over 5 years for JP Morgan Chase.
$150 million? I just want to hear that number right.
$150 million. We actually had so much fun. We overspent in 2.5 years. So now we're at $150 million through 2019, and maybe that number will be bigger by that point. But it's because it's so much good work happening on the ground in these spaces that we just wanted to continue to accelerate that work and continue to invest in it.
Great. So Jamie Shea is on this panel. He could probably be on this panel for a number of reasons. Currently, he's working at Dan Gilbert's family of companies, Rock Venture, Quicken Loans. His bio is in your packet. But another reason why he could be here is because he's an entrepreneur himself, and maybe he could talk a little bit about that. I don't know whether you were, well, maybe you could describe what you were doing in 2006, 2007, or shortly thereafter. But then also he worked at a firm called Mission Throttle, where he was responsible for helping build a pipeline or look at the opportunities to build a pipeline of impact investment. So there's a lot of things that he could contribute to this conversation. I know he will just contribute a little bit right now, and maybe you'll ask questions of him later. But Jamie, maybe you could talk in particular about Dan Gilbert and his arrival and his contributions to the entrepreneurial conversation, but also your experience as an entrepreneur as well.
Yeah, if we get into the latter, it might go on for a while, so I'm going to keep it short. But thank you for at least prepping it, because I think the fact that I do come from a entrepreneurial background frames a lot of the way that I look at the issues in Detroit. And I do have the benefit of coming here a little bit later than some of these other folks. Actually, everyone here was here when I was here, and I'm from New York City originally, and came for grad school, University of Michigan, and came into an ecosystem that was already being rebuilt, and had the luxury of being able to look at the small gaps that still needed to be filled when a lot of the people here had already started to fill the large gaps. But I now work with, like as you said, Rock Ventures and Quicken. James Chapman is right over there. He's the director of entrepreneurship as well. So I'm really coming into a framework that he and others had already started building, and it's actually, I'll take a little bit of the evolution of the way that Quicken and Rock sort of evolved in their approach to entrepreneurship in the city, just so that to frame it's a little bit of a confusing entity sometimes for people to understand. And so you have Rock Ventures is the parent company that sits over all of Dan Gilbert's investments, which include Quicken Loans. Quicken Loans being the biggest of those entities. A lot of the funding for the work that we do particularly comes from Quicken Loans, and so you can think of it almost as a CSR arm, corporate social responsibility arm of Quicken, although we also work with the other 120 companies that Dan Gilbert has invested in. And so we are not, legally speaking, a foundation, and I say that because it gives us more flexibility to do things that other people sometimes have challenges in, particularly when you're dealing with entrepreneurship and you start moving into the for-profit space and the intersection there. So in terms of the work, initially there was Dan and Quicken focused on, there's 2 strategies, but one was particularly around what's known as BISDM. I see Maria sitting over here. Maria worked at BISDM, and it was an accelerator. And it was an accelerator focused on young entrepreneurs from around the country, focusing them and hoping that they would move to Detroit. And a lot of them looked like tech entrepreneurs. And after a lot of resources were put into it, a lot of work, they said, you know what, we like this approach, but we also want to be thinking more about our community entrepreneurs as well. And so that shifted to, there's a little bit of thought put in the last year or 2 around what that strategy would look like. And now it's come out with sort of a 3-pronged approach, thinking about what are the individual stages that an entrepreneur goes through. And then I think also a way to think about it is we're looking at it from what can, because of our position as Quicken, our position as Rock, what can we uniquely do that others cannot necessarily do within the ecosystem, trying to make it so that we're not being redundant. And so on the launch side, and we also too think about it as a funder, and we also operate programs as well too, which is a little bit unique. So on the launch side, we have a number of different organizations that are out in the community helping entrepreneurs with their business plans, getting ready for to get their own funding. And so in that space, really what we're talking about, and I think someone mentioned ideas to action earlier. That's actually the way we think about it as well. How do we get 1,000 ideas to action? And we do that by providing the necessary financial resources to organizations like Build Institute, Access, Prosper Us. These are all Lifeline. These are all essentially business consulting and advisory services for young entrepreneurs, getting them to be ready to launch their business, make a decision not to launch their business potentially, or to take on loans from the CDFIs and other parts of the investment community. So that's what we focus on the launch side. And I'd also say there too, we are starting to do some work with the city of Detroit and helping the city get through what is now an increasing number of applications to start businesses, building permits, and trying to make that process more efficient for entrepreneurs. And so that's work that we're doing alongside of the city and just trying to provide additional resources to the city for that. Then we think about how do we help entrepreneurs grow. We look then internally to think about the resources that Rock has and also what our spend is with vendors, so our procurement. So at the moment, we spend in the hundreds of millions of dollars actually with Detroit companies, and we're thinking about how do we double that. And part of that is obviously working internally with our procurement team, to say, hey, have you thought about this company or that company as a potential source of whatever it is that we might be procuring. But in addition, it's how do we work with the entrepreneurs in the community, making sure that they're ready to be able to work with a big corporation like Quicken. And we've actually worked with Goldman Sachs in that capacity, and also Bloomberg Philanthropies, that has done that same work in New York City. So that's something that James in particular heads up and is focused on a daily basis. And then we think about scale. How do we scale companies? And this is sort of the area I focus in on the most. Just this past May, Quicken did a prize competition called Detroit Demo Day, gave away $1 million to Detroit entrepreneurs. This year that was done in conjunction with a company called WeWork, which you may be familiar with, who gave away an additional $1.5 million. So there you're looking at $2.5 million given away in a single day, which was great to Detroit entrepreneurs. And it could have been all entrepreneurs. It could have been tech entrepreneurs. It could have been entrepreneurs that were looking to do brick and mortar. It didn't make a difference. And so in addition to that capital, and we provided that capital in the form of no interest loans, and also with no personal guarantee. And I'm saying that specifically because as we think about one of the gaps that I see, it's in the risk of, we do not have enough risk-tolerant capital in the space. And so that's one of the things that we were trying to do there. And in addition, trying to think about what are the wraparound resources that we can provide to help some of these companies really scale. And that's the work that I focus on now. So not just doing the competition, but how do we now think about these 8 winners that we've had and think about how do we help them grow, not only within the city, but also nationally. And I'll stop there, but that's a big focus of the work.
Great. So before I introduce Benji and he says a few words, get thinking about the questions or contributions that you might want to make to the conversation. I have lots more follow-up questions for the panel, but I want to draw the audience into the conversation as early as possible. So Benji, you're Managing Director for the Detroit and American Cities Practice Program at the Kresge Foundation. Kresge is both a contributor to the New Economy Initiative, but you've done a lot for the city outside of New Economy Initiative. How has Kresge thought about its contribution to the revitalization of Detroit, and how has that changed perhaps over the last decade or so in particular?
Well, I mean, the foundation, the Kresge Foundation, has been in the region and working in the city of Detroit for a very long time. We're 90 plus years old. And so we have a strong commitment to the city. So in some ways, our Detroit program is our hometown grant-making program. It will always be. It is, in many ways, one of the most authentic things that we do at the foundation. I think our commitment to the city has really been tested. I think not unlike what Miriam described. In 2007, I mean, there was a moment where we certainly had some board members appropriately asking, what is the scale and what are the limits to what we're going to do in Detroit? When they asked that question, I think our board, again, appropriately concluded that there really wasn't a limit. That this was our hometown, and that we would be willing to go broad and go deep and do whatever it took to help the city get back on its feet and ensure a vibrant future for the city of Detroit and all its residents. And so much of what we do in the city is really born of that sort of mission within our broader, domestic and even global kind of mission to improve lives across the world. And so, our president and CEO is fond of saying we don't lead on everything, but we certainly invest in almost everything. And so things like, for instance, K-12 reform, where we've gotten great leadership from the Skillman Foundation and others, we've sort of followed behind and put dollars in there. And I think the New Economy Initiative and the work that Miriam and Dave and Pam and Don and so many others have led around sort of regenerating or revitalizing our entrepreneurial ecosystem is just another example of where we're not leading, but we certainly want to make a contribution, and that contribution comes with capital, and it may come with other relationships and other forms of thought capital that we can offer. So that really is, that's our frame, and that's why we've continued to kind of stay invested in this work. Entrepreneurship isn't kind of a natural space for us, unlike Davidson, unlike Quicken, JP Morgan. I think we're blessed now to have a lot of foundations that and a lot of investors in the city who really understand entrepreneurship, who have a strong kind of tie to it. And so I think we approach it sort of very cautiously, very carefully. But where we see something collaborative and something smart, we want to be a part of it. And I think that's what the New Economy Initiative has represented for the last number of years.
So the New Economy Initiative last year produced a report, looks like this, except without the Post-it note. And I believe there are copies somewhere right across from the registration table. Definitely pick up a copy. Let me just see if there are questions from the room or comments before I ask a few follow-up questions. Great. I knew this would be a lively bunch. Why don't we go here and then... Oh, no, the mic is... Okay, go ahead.
Good morning. I'm Jason Zylstra with the DeVos Foundations in Grand Rapids. And I think one of the things NEI did early on in the process was take a look at the ecosystem of support organizations for entrepreneurs in the community. And maybe I'm wrong, but kind of figured it was a bit of a mess. What did you as NEI and what can foundations do to organize, streamline, align, fill in gaps to try to make the groups that exist to support entrepreneurs be more effective in what they do?
So that's a great question. Let me give you the condition at the time we started this work. So there were a handful of accelerators and a few spread like into the wind organizations working in entrepreneurial spaces. The state was the leading funder and was rewarding them based on a per head count of who came in the front door. So you have Techtown, and if you looked across the street last night, across boroughs, you saw Next Energy. So if 35 feet from each other. If someone walked into Techtown, and the Techtown people knew they really needed to be at Next Energy, and they let them out the door, they lost the per head count and the dollars. By the way, today is the school count day in Michigan, so we're counting heads to determine how much money every school system gets, so we didn't learn from this process. So ultimately, we had entrepreneurs dying inside the system because there was no connectivity. So one of the first things we did after we got some general funding going is we said we're not going to, we'll look at general operating support, we'll look at work, but we want to measure your connectivity and your inclusiveness. So you set the goals. Before we write the check, sit with our evaluator, you sit with our team, and you talk about how you're going to connect and how you're going to all work together. Now in the meantime, we also had created this thing called the BizGrid, where we looked at all of the entrepreneurial services. It was written for entrepreneurs to find them. We had events called BizGrid Live, where people could come in and find the people they needed, and something magical happened. They started to point to each other. Well, I don't do that, but Tasha does. You should go talk to her across the room. But when we started measuring the connectivity and evaluation and judging them on that, and then we did something foundations don't do. We said, we're going to pay you quarterly. We want to measure your connectivity and your inclusiveness on a quarterly basis. Not to be punitive, but if you're missing the mark, we want to know why. We want to know how you're going to adjust, what you're going to do about it. And I don't think we pulled back, any I team that's here, I don't think we ever pulled back a grant because they missed the mark. But we saw this constant retooling and how they were connecting. It took 5 years before we started seeing the results. We could almost measure it to the day when they started really referring each other across the system. And then while that was happening, we started filling gaps in the ecosystem. Our mandate was grassroots to high growth. We started with high growth. Why? They were the only institutions in the market. So the grassroots pieces, the groups Tasha named, the Build Institute, Prosper Us, Access, NEI was the lead funder in all of those to get them started. Other funders filled in. But then continued to measure this connectivity and inclusiveness notion. So without the intermediary role of constantly saying, how are you talking to each other? This would have never happened. And while I've got the floor, I have a big fear. Brad Feld said it takes 20 years to build an ecosystem. I think that's at least 20 years to build an ecosystem. NEI as the intermediary has been at this work for 10. We're halfway home. My fear is funders are going to get fickle and start pulling back, and we'll never get the system fully built. So I would challenge everybody thinking about this space, are you really in it for 20 years? Because that's how long it's going to take for an ecosystem to become somewhat self-sustaining.
I want to just add something to it as a caution. So there's been a lot of groups funded. We fund a number of the ones that Dave just mentioned. It can be a little bit challenging because there's so many that within the ecosystem, and if it's challenging for us as funders when it's our job, imagine the entrepreneurs, and Andrew referred to this a little bit, trying to look at the resources available to them and to make sense of it. It's a little bit of like a brand soup, and so I struggle on a daily basis, and James and I talk about it, and folks at NEI talk about it, is each of them are serving a different constituency, but at the end, one may be focused on a certain neighborhood or a certain demographic, but at the end of the day, as an entrepreneur, you're just looking for the resources that you need, and from a marketing standpoint, it is very hard for them to understand which one to necessarily go to and what's available. So in a for-profit space, there would probably be greater consolidation at that level. And so I think it's something that is, from an ecosystem standpoint, we have to be conscious of who we're serving, and are the multiple organizations making it more confusing for the people that actually need the resources.
We've got a couple questions at this table now, 3 questions. Okay.
I'm struck by the fact that your work came out of a crisis, and that enabled all of you to sort of drop what your priorities were and cooperate with each other. And it seems as if in our country, it's not really it's a simmering crisis more than a catastrophe. And I wonder if you've given any thought to how to duplicate what you're doing when the CEO of your operations aren't necessarily focused on how to get rural communities involved in the current economy or other things, and what we could how we could get the energy behind activities that just isn't coming because it's not on the front page of the newspapers every day.
So how do you create a sense of crisis or urgency around the opportunity or focus and alignment as well across institutions with lots of different interests? Anyone want to take that?
I can start. The investment we made in Detroit did come out of a crisis, obviously the bankruptcy, and we had been investing for a while, but certainly the coordination part. We approached this from a perspective of saying to ourselves, if we can get it right in Detroit at this point when there's so much happening and so much movement, and there is a lot of assets that we can build on. If we can get it right now, if we can actually insert ourselves at this point and build off of what's already happening here, that we could hopefully build a model that we could take across, to other cities that aren't necessarily obviously in bankruptcy, but are struggling with the same kind of issues that Detroit is struggling with, but at a different scale. So we're 3 years into our investment cycle now. We just announced our model for change. It became our corporate responsibility book, basically, was looking at Detroit and what we did in Detroit over the last 3 years and the coordination, all the different pieces that went into it, research and data and talent and capital and alternative capital and coordination with our other foundations and all these different parts of that we had to put together to actually make the investment work. And now take that model and kind of bundle it up and work with other cities and see if those pieces and those elements that we talked about before that were on the ground, if they're on the ground, if those pieces are there, then we can actually kind of start to insert more of our corporate responsibility into play. So we've actually launched in the last 2 weeks 2 new cities based on the Detroit model, one in Chicago for $40 million, a 3-year commitment there, and then DC this past week, a $10 million commitment. Based on what we've done here in the city of Detroit. And I don't think that those cities are necessarily in crisis. In some respects, they have issues just like we have here, but it wasn't because of this one bubbling up or the sense of urgency to do something around the economy. It was more saying that we know you have some of the same type of issues that exist in Detroit at a different scale, and we love to, to bring some of those pieces and talk to you about how to coordinate what you have here on the ground in a way to resolve some of the things that you're looking to resolve.
So Miriam, I want you to answer the question because you actually said in your opening remarks that you'd let somebody ask you how you convinced all the funders to contribute that initial $100 million. You said that there was maybe a sense of crisis, but you also said that the first response to your requests or your outreach was, that's not what we do. So how did you convince them?
Well, let me just start by saying I think this country is in crisis. So I think what we've done here is needed and you can replicate. But you have to speak to what the crisis is.
Right.
We knew what our crisis was, 50 years of just downward spiral. One of the things that Pam and we were talking about and Ralph earlier this week is that we know we've got success in growing entrepreneurs, but what are we doing about being totally inclusive and working in the really hard parts of our community? We've got a good track record. I guess our minority and business startups are almost 3 times the national average, and my number may be about right. But in all of your communities, in our country, we've got to pay attention to growing those entrepreneurs in the less traditional areas and maybe in different ways. We spoke to our crisis, and we convinced everybody that working together, and NEI is now owned by 13 foundations. It may be administered out of us, but it's now, I think, fully owned by those foundations because they saw that alignment was important, scale was necessary, and not wanting to duplicate all the things that were happening. If you can name your crisis, I think you will pull folks together, and that's the way we raise the money. If our community continued on its downward spiral at that point, we were bankrupt and so forth, it didn't matter what your programmatic areas were. If you were interested in education, if your community was falling apart and you didn't have the entrepreneurial growth that we had had in our community decades before, your programs weren't going to do anything. So our job, I thought, was to name the crisis, and that's how you raise money.
Can I add one more thing to that? Because I think that the New Economy Initiative is a real success in terms of a philanthropic collaborative coming together to take on an issue and showing some real, clear outcomes, positive outcomes. But I have to confess, and I don't want to tell stories out of school, but we haven't always been successful. I mean, we've tried a number of these things across a number of different issues. And I say that only to sort of recognize that the success rate is actually probably pretty low in terms of kind of civic collaboratives coming together, take on education, youth violence, entrepreneurship, whatever it is. And I think you kind of have to recognize that. And we actually had a lot of irons in the fire. And this is one that was really successful. And we actually, I think, leveraged this success into another great success, which was the Grand Bargain. And I think the little told story is that the Grand Bargain really came together so quickly, the resolution of the bankruptcy in terms of how philanthropy contributed, because of the success we'd had working together through the New Economy Initiative. If I look at around that table of foundations on the Grand Bargain, it was basically our New Economy Initiative steering committee that got together, and I think that helped to quickly drive towards a resolution, a set of solutions, or an offering that we could bring to the table. But I just want to point out that I think you can't, and I think you can't just pick one thing and then sort of beat your head against the wall for 3 years trying to get everyone aligned around that one thing. I think in this community we had a dozen things, and we weren't successful in all of them, but a few of them, the collaboratives really showed great success.
Right. I want to give 3 tactical responses to your question. One, how do you define entrepreneurship? NEI chose to define it very, very broadly on purpose. So I would argue that a lot of our work, particularly in the grassroots area, was not entrepreneurs. It was business owners and managers. They weren't starting up something new. They were not innovating to integration the way you think about entrepreneurs doing that. That was by design, because entrepreneur was a buzzword that was sexy at the time, and we could drive people's behavior into an ecosystem based on the word. Second is storytelling. So very quickly we found out, Neil Rubin's over in the corner taking notes, so I need to be careful. Mainstream media in this city wouldn't cover entrepreneurs because everyone came to Detroit to write about the autos. So nobody would write anything, no matter what happened. Until Dan Gilbert made a big stake, you didn't have anything in the mainstream media. So we actually went out and formed a partnership with the minority news publications. The Hispanic News, the Arab American News, the Jewish News, the Korean Weekly, and there's one more.
Michigan Chronicle.
The Michigan Chronicle, thank you. And we funded some of their reporting around entrepreneurship, and they cross-pollinated. So you had the Jewish News writing about Arab businesses, and the Arab News writing about Jewish businesses. And that storytelling was really, really important. And then the third piece is stimulus. So it feeds the storytelling in the ecosystem. Accelerate Michigan Innovation Competition is happening this month. We founded it at NEI along with the state and some others. The purpose was to bring venture capital folks in. NEI Ideas Competition, which came later, focused very much on grassroots businesses in the city of Detroit's footprint. Hamtramck and Highland Park are 2 cities in the middle. There's like holes in the donut. And the focus was bin-ups, those businesses that had been here, not startups, but the bin-ups, the ones that have been here, been active, and that competition is currently underway. And we were told by experts, nobody will come to the party. They're not going to believe a primarily white-looking foundation in a minority community. In year 1, 650 businesses applied, about the same every year after. And the most moving part of this work was those ceremonies, and watching these sometimes 75-year-old businesses get recognized for a $10,000 grant to grow their business. And here's the kicker. We didn't do it for the recognition. We did it so we could geomap those businesses, go back to our ecosystem and say, find a way to provide technical assistance to every one of these applicants, regardless of if they win or lose. And so the real success stories are coming from folks that are showing up to marketing programs, accounting programs, etc., from that system that never received the award. PricewaterhouseCoopers is a partner, reviewed the financial financial well-being and gave a score to the 100 plus finalists every year of that process. Most had receipts in a shoebox. Suddenly an accountant comes in a friendly way and helps you get your finances right. So that stimulus is probably the most important thing we did in tying it to the ecosystem.
Okay, a couple more questions at this table. Raise your hand if you have other questions or contributions. I see one back there. Okay.
My name's David Odahowski. I'm with the Edith Bush Charitable Foundation in Winter Park, Florida. My question was about how you got those place-based grant makers to contribute a dollar for entrepreneurship, because that's a dollar that won't go to the arts. You answered that, but what did you name this crisis? What was the short? You said name the crisis. So how did you convey that in a short, meaningful way?
I think that's for you, Marion.
Yeah. I think anybody can answer it. Our crisis was that we were totally auto.
Mm-hmm.
The economy was going to hell, and we needed to diversify. We needed to rekindle that entrepreneurial spirit. So for us, it was, if we're going to save this community, we need a vibrant, for-profit entrepreneurial sector to really work. Doesn't sound like something we should do, but we named it as, we got to diversify the regional economy using those talent, innovation, culture change. For us, it was really survival.
Okay.
We'd name it differently today. I'll think of something different, because we're still raising money.
Do you have, still have a question? Yeah. Okay.
I want to ask Jamie what kind of ROI metrics you use in your investing.
ROI for an actual, so it ranges. So are you talking about for a specific investment that we're making, or are you talking about like the hypothetical ROI for
The hypothetical ROI, but I mean, I'm sure there's sort of at least double bottom line. So what are the things you're measuring? Because you're not getting typical return and you're investing, as I understand, out of a for-profit entity.
So we are coming out of Quicken. That money is out of a for-profit entity, but when it comes down to the sort of the community investment group, then that actually comes out, a lot of that dollar is coming out in forms of grants. So we do, in the work that we specifically do with the entrepreneurs, we actually do provide, in the case, we just chose a specific investment vehicle for the prize competition we did, there was zero interest loans. And so competitions are challenging. I mean, you need to do things that are for clarity's sake. But I think there's a different mentality. This is going back to my impact investing days. I'll channel Philip Fisher and Doug Stewart. But I think when you give somebody an investment, whether it's a loan or an equity investment, the type of relationship is different. And I think from the people that are taking on the loan, they really think through what they're doing and how they're going to spend that money, because they have that added sense of responsibility. And I think what also happens is the people that are providing it are saying, hey, my relationship with you is not done right now, it is just starting. And so we think about it, with these entrepreneurs, these are loans over a 6-year period. First year, no payments, and so it's a 6-year, minimum relationship, and that whatever money we get back is going right back out to the next entrepreneur who needs financing, and so we want to make sure that money comes back. And so we're working. It's one of the reasons I have a job, right? It's like I'm there to make sure that those entrepreneurs get the resources that they need. I would say just because we have a lot of loan dollars in this system, because it's just the way that our system is set up in terms of banks. PRI dollars tend to be easier to do on the loan side as well. One of our gaps that we have is early stage equity financing or equity-like financing. Equity can be a little complicated, and you mentioned it earlier that we do have a lot of money sitting in our community as well, and it's represented by people on the stage. One of the gaps that I missed, or something that I didn't understand, was that we actually don't have a lot of people in this community with wealth that have experience doing private direct investments, whether or not that's a direct loan or certainly on the equity side. And so without having that, it's actually a huge jump to be able to think about what it means to do equity, how to do it. And a lot of times, foundations, a program officer may not necessarily have the background to do that, and so they immediately jump to their investment committee. Well, a lot of times the investment committee is used to investing in a mixed portfolio of stocks and bonds, and they also don't know how to do it. So again, I also want to say everything Andrew said earlier, like 10 times 10, everything he said is so spot on. And you really need to have someone, there's going to be a lot of failures, and you can't as a foundation think that you failed because only one of your investments paid off. I mean, that's a huge success. And you have to get everyone else in the foundation, you have to teach them that. You have to teach your board members that that's the way that it works. Because the foundations are such a great opportunity to do this type of work. And as Andrew said, they are also the hardest to do it in. You have the most risk-tolerant capital around. You're used to giving out grants all the time. The second a foundation seems to give out an investment, or you say that word, it gets super risk-averse. And I think it's because they're used to trying to maintain, the endowment. That's what the investment committee is there for, to make sure you can continue to give out those grants. But that's something I've watched and I've been astounded, but it's the structural system that sits around the foundations that makes people act in that particular way. And so it'll take time within the foundations and all of you sitting here to think about how do we educate the other members of your trustees, the investment committees, the other program officers to start being very risk tolerant when you're doing investments.
Can I pick up this thread?
Yeah,
Okay.
I was wondering if you wanted to jump in here.
I do want to pick up this thread on the risk-tolerant capital, because I wrote that down earlier and was trying to figure out how to weave that back in. I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about something that's happening in the entrepreneurial ecosystem right now. We piloted something with another foundation, the Kellogg Foundation, called Entrepreneurs of Color Fund. And what we were finding, and we have been seeing some of the community development financial institutions tinker in the space a little bit, and one that's doing it very well, Detroit Development Fund, is working with the bin-ups, the bin-up contracting. Contractors and the bin-up organizations that have been doing skilled trades work for the last 10, 15 years, but at a small scale. And one of the problems that we have in the city of Detroit right now is that we have tons of infrastructure projects. You see cranes all over the place as well downtown, but minority contractors aren't able to compete for some of the business that's happening because they're not at the scale that they need to be to do so. And it's because they don't have the capital and they don't have the, as we call them, the 3 C's, the capital, the clients, and the consulting base to do so, the talent, as you called it, Andrew. So we wanted to fill this gap, at least in the capital space, as a financial institution, and started the Entrepreneurs of Color Fund, which is a $7 million fund right now, to provide very specific resources to contractors if they want to contract, right? So we'll give you a job-specific loan, tailored to the size of your business, tailored to the size of that contract, tailored to for a time, for specific time. And we also provided startup resources, and this is very risk-averse dollars. These are grant dollars that were put in as loan loss reserves to protect other investments to make this fund work. And we thought this would be something that maybe after 3 or 4 years would pick up steam. We found out in less than a year that we were going to be out of capital before year 2. And we're now fundraising for the second round of this fund because those resources were so needed by contractors to actually compete in the market. It was so needed for startup companies to go from having micro loans of 5 and 10 and friends and family dollars. They needed that $50,000 insert or that $150,000 insert to get their business started or to start the second location somewhere in the business. And we haven't had, we're just now possibly having a default of the almost 60 loans that we've made in the program. So I guess thinking about the fact that the foundations can actually act in this space and take the less sexy approach, which for us was loan loss provision, protecting somebody else's investment, right, with our grant dollars, and looking at PRI dollars that are patient and long-term, and putting into a loan fund like this is something we can expand and advance in other ways, and we're actually taking the model across the country as well. So there are still gaps. We know that there are other ways. Maybe the fund should be bigger. Maybe we should be advancing loans of $250,000 out of the fund. We're learning. It's only 2.5 years old. But another innovation has come with the foundations kind of working together, and more foundations are attracted to the fund and are looking at it right now. So I would be remiss if I didn't actually mention that there are some gaps in the market, and we're actually looking at trying to fill those gaps in financing.
I'm just curious, in the room, how many of you represent foundations or are engaged in some form of impact investing? I'm just curious. Okay, again, a larger number than I had anticipated. So we're seeing more people looking at tools beyond the grant,
Yeah, we like
whether
that.
it's loan guarantees, equity investments. So maybe we could hear more of that either in this conversation or over time today. Okay, I see lots of hands going up now. We're going to get back to this table, and then I think we might go back to the back of the room. Okay.
John Riley with the Edith Bush Charitable Foundation as well. So it's become apparent that the collaboration is what has made this successful, and I am gathering that that was through the New Economy Initiative back in 2007. Miriam, you said 13 foundations own the New Economy Initiative, and Tasha, I would think that are some of your $150 million in investments going through NEI as well, or is
We're
it?
talking about that now. I don't know if you had any corporate donors at the time in NEI, so I don't, that wasn't the space that they were looking at. But I certainly now, corporate foundations, at least ours, is interested in these kind of collaborations and fund in that way in a pool. I mean, I don't think corporate foundations thought about it at that time of doing pool funding. It was probably hard for even the foundations to think about it.
I don't think it's pragmatic for corporations when you think about it, because corporations participate because of self-interest. And
ouch.
I know, but hey, it's nothing wrong with it. I mean, it's Mother Teresa acting with self-interest.
It's true.
The corporations getting in a pool is less logical because they can't focus on the individual programs and say, look, here's a sign of success for our programs.
Right.
So I don't think, well, NEI struggled with this notion of should corporations be in, and we tried several different angles. I think the fact that we've got the market working and you're in the investments inside the institutions is the same result. Whether it's claimed by NEI or not, we're getting the same results from that. So my opinion's changed about that over the years. At first I thought the corporations ought to be the major funders of NEI. I've come to the conclusion that philanthropy can't be the market. And ultimately, the market has to own it, and NEI has to step back, play its coordinating role, and let the market own some of these pieces, whether they're philanthropic contributions or direct investments into the people of color.
That's right. That's right. And I mean, for us, success looks like the market taking over these funds. That we're measuring not based on a direct ROI that's coming from the organizations that we're funding. We're measuring based on the fact that private investment starts to follow behind what we do. So if we do something and it actually sparks private investment to come into that neighborhood and actually buy the next building and rehab it on its own, then we've done what we were trying to do. We're trying to accelerate more the market return, the market actually coming back. And so that's really where the ROI for us, where's the leveraging factors and what we're able to do. If we put this dollar in the market, will another financial institution or corporation come behind us and actually put in their senior debt? That's what we're trying to see happen, and that's where we're actually measuring our success in this program too. So.
Well, just a follow-on question on NEI, and it might be for Pamela, but how do you do governance? Because when you have 13 foundations...
Bless you.
Miriam has the scars to prove this.
This is a long conversation, but you all do collaborations. They're never easy. And when you have something of this scale, and you have national and local funders, it is a journey, and it will continue to be a journey. And it's not easy. It's a real credit that Dave was able to put together what he did, and what Pam is now going to make it different over time. The governance is that I can tell you where it is today, and then it was very different at the beginning. I think there is real faith and trust in the leadership, as in Dave and now Pam, with a group of the foundations, but now entrepreneurs, giving guidance on a sort of ongoing basis. And the foundations can all participate in various subcommittees. But in my view is that now there is real faith in sort of a small group that works with staff. Ultimately, all the grants are made through the Community Foundation, but we have never, ever done anything other than what was brought to us to prove and pass through. And I think people now understand that's the way it works. At the beginning, it was every CEO of all these foundations came around a group and they were the governing group. It didn't work. Be glad to talk to you. Is that okay?
That's good. Well done.
Yeah, I think that's off the book, but again, a reminder, this is a nice summary of NEI's accomplishments, and there is some talk about the challenges as well. I want to tie some themes together because I think your question raises it, and this conversation does, and some of the earlier questions or contributions. So I think one is, Dave, you talked about this being a multi-decade process, and we're just in the middle of it. And it's important both at the beginning but throughout to make sure that we're defining the crisis in ways that mobilize attention, alignment, and commitments of resources. It's important to your question to make sure that the governance of the allocation of those resources is updated over time. I'll just say at the William Davidson Foundation, we've gone through a lot of change just since we made the first commitment to NEI. I think when we first made it, we were not a staffed foundation. Okay, this was just, 3-4 years ago or so. Now we have 16 full-time professionals working with our board to make decisions about how to further the entrepreneurial ecosystem. So it's not only about making sure you define the crisis in ways that's relevant and mobilizing. It's not just about getting the governance right, but it's also making sure to update the philanthropic collaborative's value proposition to the contributors that may themselves be changing a lot. And I talked about our changes. Benji talked a little bit about the change that Kresge has gone on through the decade. But I think for a philanthropic collaborative to be successful, you need to pay attention to all those things. I know there was a question in the back. Yes.
I'm curious as to, is there a target date for the ecosystem to become self-sustaining? Or are we looking at a perpetual grant-making obligation?
I always like the phrase ecosystem because it gives the indication of how complicated this is. And that's some of our friends in this space have talked about economic gardening, if you've heard that term. I hate that term because gardens give you a semblance that everything is planted, right? The tomatoes are in the same place and you know where the carrots are. This is a rainforest. You don't know what's going to grow where. So the ecosystem will evolve based on the market and the passion of the people within it. And I don't think we can artificially try to put a date on what will happen. Now, what Pam has done since in the last few years, where NEI is being driven through Pam and Maria and Don and Matt and others, is they're moving away from, or they're moving more intentionally into the inclusive and grassroots space, where there's more of a dependency on subsidy, because those institutions simply cannot make it in the market right now. Some of the things we funded early in the high growth space, they're moving away from, saying the market needs to start driving those more aggressively. So they're reacting to the environment, and I think to try to do anything that's artificial on a time frame would be detrimental to the ecosystem itself.
I actually don't even think an entrepreneurial ecosystem is ever going to be self-sustaining. Is Wayne State University going to be self-sustaining? Is University of Michigan going to be self-sustaining? If you look at Silicon Valley, is Stanford University ever going to be self-sustaining? I think we have to recognize it's really just degrees of subsidy and where that subsidy comes from. And I think that's what we struggle with at the NEI table, because I do think we floated for a few years, especially the past few years, this notion that somehow the private sector and private markets could take out philanthropy, and I just don't think it's built like that. And so we've got to now sort of reconcile ourselves to what our role will be going forward, where the public sector is actually to take out, and just think about, again, degrees of subsidy.
Yeah, I think there is where it might shift a little bit is the philanthropy's role with specific like individual entrepreneurs and getting very close down to that individual investment. I agree with Benji completely that it will always, play a role at the higher institutional level. I think you can, as I think through it, as like the gaps that I see here, one of them is it's talent, but I'd say it's more experience in a way. We have a lot of talented people. We have not had enough time to have those talented people work within high growth companies that have been well funded around other experienced people, and it's going to take time. I mean, if you think about the life cycle of a company, of a high growth company, it's going to take an entrepreneur 7 to 10 years probably to be able to get a meaningful exit. That entrepreneur then has a windfall of cash, takes them a few years to think about what am I actually going to do with that cash. Then they start being those angel investors that invest back into the system and start providing mentorship. And we're not at a stage now where we have really had those exits yet. We are still at a stage where we are providing initial investment into some of these companies. These founders have not generated their wealth yet, and are just, like as Andrew said, head down in their business. And so at the moment, we need to be the ones providing that mentorship. We need to be the ones that are providing some of that angel capital. But at a certain point, the system will go far enough so that those people will have their windfalls and they will pay it back. But I agree with Benji that there is always, even in Silicon Valley, an institutional level and government level of funding. Certainly R&D is a classic one at the institutions. So I think it'll shift a little bit over time, but we'll always be there.
So if I can add, as a foundation, a community foundation, we are now very focused on how do we keep these entrepreneurs in Southeast Michigan, because they're going to be drawn away from us. We've made all this investment, and so we're now really starting to think about how do you connect these people in the community in a way that it's harder for them to just sort of say, I'm going away. Education is going to be a big piece. So that for us is the long-term play now. Let's get these entrepreneurs, get them successful. I'd love to share, but not with you all. I want to hear.
We haven't talked a lot about the data, but some of the data bears this out in terms of we've seen over the last few years a real uptick in terms of startup activity along a number of different indices here in Detroit. We're still, though, lagging behind when it comes to growth or high growth institutions, the scale ups, and so that's going to be the work of the next decade. And I agree with you, Benji, that it is not going to be a system or an ecosystem that doesn't require subsidy at some forms. But Jamie, to your point, I think there should be, and I think there will be an evolution in terms of the way that the system supports individual entrepreneurs. We should see that. So, we're coming down, we're winding down. Maybe just a few quick questions or contributions. So Raj, others? Okay.
Yeah, Raj Melville from the Deshpande Foundation, and we're also involved in a lot of entrepreneurship ecosystem building. And so my question is, when you look at the ecosystem, other than the obvious indicators in terms of starts and businesses and stuff like that, are there other indicators in terms of mindset change in community? Has the community changed? Have you looked at it before? Are you looking at it now? Are there surveys? I mean, has culture changed?
Wait a minute, don't point at me. What NEI is now doing 10 years out, and I should let Pam really speak here, is start to ask those questions. What does the environment look like now, from basic economics to everything else? And so we're trying to figure out who can help us do that, because we did that 10 years ago. We also know that while a lot of things have happened, we don't know whether we were the impact or not. So we're never going to be able to judge that. But we do want to look at where we are so we can decide where the next 50 million goes. The culture change piece, Dave has struggled with it. I think Pam has. That's the hardest piece. This sounds really crazy, but the biggest culture change piece that has helped us was GM going bankrupt. Because everybody here thought that their grandfather worked in the auto industry, their father, and they were going to do it, and they didn't have to stay in school, and they didn't have to get retrained. I think that bankruptcy started to really change that. We've done a lot of storytelling, but the culture change piece is beyond me, and I'll pause there because the experts are in the room here.
I could share one metric that helps us evaluate some of the shifts, and not just our investment, but just in general what's happening in neighborhoods as we're thinking about if place is actually becoming place in neighborhoods. We have an extraordinary amount of data. We actually created our own institute because we bank every other household in the U.S. So we can look at consumer behavior, we can look at patterns, we can look at when people are swiping their credit cards and kind of see the trend lines change. And we are looking at, we release these local indexes, and it shares information about where people are spending, kind of broadly where trends are happening, where people are spending their money. And we can kind of start to make some assertions about if a neighborhood is kind of changing, or if people are actually picking up that entrepreneurs are coming into the space, there are new businesses opening up here, and people are spending their money at those businesses. So that's one of the things that we look at as we're looking at our investment, is kind of looking at the consumer behavior. Is there still leakage out into the suburbs? Are people still going to the grocery stores outside of Detroit, or are we actually getting people shopping and eating and spending their dollars inside of in certain neighborhoods in different patterns? So that's one way of us kind of looking at whether or not the work that we're putting into these neighborhoods as we're trying to build place outside of the downtown area, and looking at these different neighborhoods and putting big investment dollars, the strategic neighborhood fund, the different things that we're doing in Detroit, is kind of looking at the consumer behavior and hoping that mimics what we're trying to have happen, which is that people are starting to localize and spending, and the dollars are churning in our neighborhoods and our local environment.
So we're just about at time. I want to leave room for the panelists just to say a few closing remarks if they have any. And Benji, maybe we could start down there if you have any closing thoughts.
Yeah, well, it's not a closing thought. I'll just pick up on what was just said as my final remark. I mean, these are humble, modest Detroiters. I grew up in Boston, so absolutely it's changed. I mean, the last 10 years, I can absolutely tell you there's been a shift culturally. I have to say the region is impressively entrepreneurial, even in the automotive sector with all the different suppliers. And so it's a little harder to gauge there, but in Detroit, absolutely, there's way more entrepreneurial energy. The narrative has shifted, all sorts of things. And the challenge we have is that we didn't really do a baseline measurement. And so we've done some surveys, you guys have done some research, we've done some surveys, et cetera, at Kresge. And so we get really positive response about this sort of entrepreneurialism in Detroit, but we don't really have a baseline, so we can't reference it to anything. And the other thing we don't know is sort of when you're looking at things like what people are saying and what they're talking about and what the FREEP is writing about, et cetera, you don't know if it's like a leading indicator or a lagging indicator. So are they writing about it because it's already happening, or are they sort of writing about it because and it's pushing it to happen? They're sort of foretelling something that's going to happen. But at the end of the day, I can tell you, people are, this place is seen as a much more entrepreneurial place. When I'm sitting on an airplane and someone's talking about it, when I'm reading about it in the Boston Globe if I go home to Boston, and when I'm here, Detroit, absolutely, the narrative has shifted, and the energy is really positive around this issue.
I'm tempted to stop right there, but Jamie.
Oh man, yeah, I don't want to follow that. I agree. I'm going to take it, because I agree with everything that Benji just said. I'm going to take a different track. I'm just going to do some advice for the foundation crew, a little unsolicited. So we're still in the world of working with entrepreneurs directly, and we're not, haven't graduated to the space of working with institutions. Trying to think about how you can relate to entrepreneurs is really important. And Andrew even talked about his challenge around dress. So I'm going to stand up. James, stand up. This is it. So when we say, when we get an invitation to go somewhere in business attire, this is our business attire. So that's going to, as you are dealing with entrepreneurs, it's an important, yeah, no. So this is the way that we roll, and it's not to say, I love my suits too, but it is important to not be seen as sitting in the ivory tower and to think about how you get out and recruit down to that level. And Dave gave a great story. I remember when he was talking about the first Any Ideas, and they put it out, they wanted it to be for the whole community, and they put it out through the normal channels, and they got the normal usual suspects that looked a lot, maybe say like me, and the people that were sort of moving here to do work. And it then took him, I think, an additional, the same amount that they were trying to give out in prizes, they had to do in marketing to be able to actually reach all of the entrepreneurs that they wanted to reach. And so I think getting out there, we call that deal sourcing in the world of investing. So get out there and do your deal sourcing, dress down, and it's fun, more than anything, to getting to interact with all the entrepreneurs.
Great. Tasha, David, Miriam, just real briefly.
I don't want to follow anything that anyone in this panel said. I'll just say that there was so much work that was on the ground in Detroit from the collaboration. We learned how to basically make our investment by watching what had happened over the last 15 years. I can't say enough about collaboration and the fact that there's limited resources at any of our foundations, as big as they are, that we have to kind of work together to actually solve these major and big issues, even entrepreneurship as being one of those. But we're seeing this collaboration and this thread of actually pooling resources happen in placemaking strategies and the workforce. And so I just think that I can't say enough about having the foundations work together, working with the municipalities, working with the state, working across with corporations, working with entrepreneurs, working with residents. You just have to have everybody have a stake in whatever issue that you're trying to solve. And it's been a phenomenal process for us to see that as a corporation and evolve even our own corporate responsibility model to respond to that.
Yeah, I think it's an oxymoron to talk about philanthropy funding entrepreneurs. We are the least entrepreneurial behaving sector in the world, and if we approach this work through the lens of traditional philanthropy, we are doomed to fail. Yeah. So we have to be nimble, we have to keep changing as we move, which thank God the $100 million was got up front. Because I can't tell you the number of times that the foundation, one of the foundation CEOs or program people would call and say, "You're changing direction again." Yeah. I'm looking at your theory of change. Why do you think you can change direction? So be entrepreneurial if you're going to do this work. Be focused on the passion and the feel. The data will drive you crazy because the data will lag a decade behind where you are. You've got to feel your way through this, and it's uncomfortable in our business, and it's certainly uncomfortable to tell your board or 10 foundation CEOs, yeah, it just feels right. But in some respects, that's what this work requires.
I just want to take the opportunity to thank everybody that has been a part of this. We don't say that enough. This is what you do every day. We were in building hope. This was about building hope. And that's what you do in your grant making every day. It's a little bit different, but that's what it's all about. And that's why I think we've had success. And thanks to everybody who trusted in Dave and now Pam, who had the flexibility to do what it took.
Well, thank you, Miriam, Dave, Tasha, Jamie, Benji. Thank you all. So look forward to the rest of the day.